April of 1945. Benito Mussolini, the dictator who had controlled Italy for 20 years, attempted to escape north as the country collapsed. He was intercepted by partisans on his way to Switzerland and detained without resistance. A few hours later, the Duce was dead. His fall marked the end of fascism in Italy and the beginning of a new stage of chaos and revenge. The execution became a symbol, but also a mystery that still divides versions and responsibilities. Who decided his final fate? Why was any formal process avoided? And what led an entire country to need his death to close the war? The rise of the Duce, the birth of Italian fascism. Italy emerged from the First World War as a victorious country, but deeply fractured. The Treaty of Versailles did not grant the territories promised in 1915, generating the perception of a mutilated victory. More than 600,000 soldiers had died on the front. The economy collapsed. Inflation doubled the price of food. 2 million ex-combatants returned without finding employment. Between 1918 and 1920, more than 1,800 strikes were recorded. The workers occupied factories, raising red flags. The fear of a Bolshevik revolution spread among the owning classes. The liberal governments followed one another without the ability to restore order. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in Predappio. His father was a blacksmith and socialist activist. During his youth, he worked as a teacher and journalist. In 1912, he was leading Avanti, the newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party. He advocated for neutrality in the face of war, but in 1914 he radically changed his stance. He argued that the conflict could serve as a revolutionary catalyst. The party expelled him for ideological betrayal. He founded his own newspaper funded by industrialists and participated in the war as a soldier until he was injured in 1917. On the 23rd of March of 1919, he convened in Milan ex-combatants, expelled trade unionists, and radical nationalists. They founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. The program mixed socialist demands with aggressive nationalism, but from the beginning it emphasized violence as a method. The first groups attacked socialist headquarters and unions. In April, they set fire to the newspaper Avanti in Milan. The police rarely intervened. Between 1920 and 1921, landowners and businessmen began to finance fascist squads as an anti-socialist force. The black shirts burned cooperatives, beat labor leaders, and forced socialist mayors to resign. In Ferrara, they destroyed more than 100 peasant organizations in months. The liberal state tolerated the violence. The judges acquitted the squad members while condemning socialists. In November 1921, the movement was transformed into the National Fascist Party with more than 250,000 militants. Mussolini proclaimed himself Duce. The structure imitated military hierarchies. Support grew among industrialists, the church, and sectors of the army. In October 1922, Mussolini decided to take power. He spoke before 60,000 fascists in Naples demanding a strong government. 4 columns of between 25,000 and 30,000 men began to march towards Rome. On October 28th, Prime Minister Luigi Facta asked King Victor Emmanuel III to declare a state of siege. The monarch refused to sign the decree. On the 29th, he summoned Mussolini to Rome. On October 30th, 1922, he appointed him president of the Council of Ministers. The fascist columns entered the capital without resistance. The March on Rome was a negotiated takeover with the monarchy and the elites, not a military conquest. Mussolini formed a coalition cabinet but demanded exceptional powers. The parliament approved his request to govern by decree for 1 year. In July of 1923, he enacted the Acerbo law, guaranteeing 2/3 of the seats to the most voted list. The elections of April of 1924 were held under intimidation. The National Fascist Party obtained 65% of the votes. On the 10th of June of 1924, the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti denounced electoral fraud. That same day, he was kidnapped in broad daylight, beaten with a carpenter's file and murdered. His body appeared 2 months later. The perpetrators received light sentences, later pardoned. The opposition left Parliament hoping that the king would dismiss Mussolini. It did not happen. In January of 1925, Mussolini publicly assumed political responsibility for the violence. He declared before the chamber that if fascism had been a criminal association, he was its leader. He did not resign. He announced measures to consolidate order. Opposition parties were banned. The independent press was shut down. Free unions were dissolved. Elected mayors were replaced by appointed officials. The parliament became a decorative body. Italian democracy ceased to exist. The nation gagged, the power of absolute fear. During 1926, Mussolini enacted the fascist laws that transformed the Italian legal framework. Political parties were declared illegal. Independent unions were abolished and replaced by state corporations. The press was subjected to absolute censorship. Newspaper editors needed government authorization. Each article underwent prior review. The state radio broadcast only approved content. The position of prime minister was reformulated as head of government, duce of fascism. Mussolini ceased to answer to parliament and depended solely on the king. The ministers were appointed at the leader's will. The deputies lost legislative power. The Grand Council of Fascism acquired functions superior to parliament. Elected mayors were eliminated and replaced by podesta appointed from Rome. The Special Court for the Defense of the State was created, composed of military judges and party members. It judged political crimes without due process guarantees. The accused lacked independent defense. The sessions were secret. Sentences included death, life imprisonment, or confinement. The death penalty was reinstated for attacks against the government. Between 1927 and 1943, it prosecuted more than 5,000 people. The political confinement sent dissidents to islands like Lipari, Ustica, or Ponza. They lived crowded in barracks with insufficient food and no medical care. Correspondence was censored. Some remained for years without trial. More than 15,000 people suffered confinement. In 1927, the OVRA, Organization for Surveillance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, was founded. This secret police operated through informants distributed throughout the country. Doormen, public employees, teachers, and merchants reported on neighbors in exchange for money or favors. The OVRA conducted surveillance, nighttime raids, and arrests without a court order. The interrogations included beatings, sleep deprivation, and threats. By 1930, it maintained files on 100,000 citizens and conducted 20,000 home searches weekly. The surveillance extended outside Italy. The OVRA established networks in France, Switzerland, and Argentina, where exiles resided. The consulates provided lists of anti-fascists. Infiltrated agents attended meetings and reported names. In some cases, they coordinated extraditions or assassinations on foreign territory. The Ministry of Popular Culture controlled cinema, theatre, literature, and arts. Foreign films were modified to eliminate inappropriate content. The Luce Institute produced newsreels that were obligatorily shown in cinemas. They showed Mussolini ploughing, piloting planes, and inaugurating works. Education was subjected to total control. Textbooks presented fascism as a continuation of the Roman Empire. Classrooms displayed portraits of the Duce. University professors swore loyalty to the regime. Of 1,200 teachers, only 12 refused and were dismissed. The Opera Nazionale Balilla grouped children and adolescents in paramilitary groups. They wore uniforms, marched in formation, and practiced with wooden weapons. Participation was mandatory. The cult of Mussolini reached extraordinary dimensions. His image appeared on stamps, coins, posters, and buildings. The fascist salute became mandatory at official events. Refusal could be interpreted as opposition. The Labour Charter of 1927 established corporatism. Strikes were prohibited. Wages were negotiated under government control. Real wages decreased 20% between 1928 and 1934. The state promoted public works as propaganda. The battle for wheat sought food self-sufficiency. The demographic battle encouraged birth rates. These campaigns had limited effectiveness. Unemployment remained high. On the 11th of February 1929, the Lateran Pacts were signed with the Holy See. The agreement recognized the sovereignty of the Vatican and established Catholicism as the official religion. In exchange, the Church accepted the dissolution of the Catholic People's Party. Pope Pius XI declared that Mussolini had been sent by Providence. By 1935, more than half of the public officials were members of the National Fascist Party. Promotions depended on political loyalty. The administration executed only orders from the Duce. The opposition had been annihilated. Fear dominated social relationships. Denunciation became normalized. The empire of blood, war crimes, and colonial ambitions. In 1935, Mussolini turned his attention towards building a colonial empire. Ethiopia, one of the few African countries never colonized, was the chosen target. For 3 years, Italy concentrated more than 500,000 soldiers in Eritrea and Italian Somalia. On the 3rd of October 1935, without a formal declaration of war, the troops crossed the border. The Ethiopian army had 300,000 poorly equipped men, many armed with spears and outdated rifles. The advance was slow due to the mountainous terrain. In December of 1935, after an Ethiopian counteroffensive in Tembian, Mussolini authorized chemical weapons. Italian planes dropped mustard gas and phosgene on troops, villages, and water sources. The gas caused burns, blindness, and suffocation. Thousands died without protection. The use of chemicals violated the Geneva Protocol of 1925. Italy was a signatory. Internal military documents confirm the orders. On the 5th of May 1936, the troops entered Addis Ababa. Emperor Haile Selassie fled to England. Mussolini proclaimed the Italian Empire of East Africa. King Victor Emmanuel III was declared Emperor of Ethiopia. The occupation was maintained through systematic violence. Marriages between Italians and Ethiopians were prohibited. Sexual relations were criminalized. Ethiopians were subjected to special courts that applied floggings and mutilations. On the 19th of February of 1937, 2 young Ethiopians threw grenades at Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani during a ceremony in Addis Ababa. Graziani survived wounded. He ordered immediate reprisals. For 3 days, soldiers and settlers executed any Ethiopian they encountered. The massacre known as Yekatit 12 left between 20,000 and 30,000 dead. Some were shot, others burned alive in their homes. In the monastery of Debre Libanos, they executed more than 500 monks. In Libya, the repression against the Senussi resistance continued. More than 100,000 nomads were deported to concentration camps in the desert of Cyrenaica. They lived surrounded by barbed wire with insufficient food and no drinking water. Diseases killed more than 40% of the interned. The captured rebel leaders were publicly hanged. The suspected villages were destroyed, the wells poisoned. In July of 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Mussolini decided to intervene, supporting General Francisco Franco against the Republican government. In December, he created the Corpo Truppe Volontarie with 70,000 soldiers. Officially, they were volunteers but consisted of regular army units. In March of 1937, they suffered defeat in Guadalajara against the international brigades. Italian aviation was more effective. The Aviazione Legionaria deployed hundreds of planes that bombarded Republican cities. Malaga, Barcelona, Alicante, Almeria, and Durango were attacked repeatedly. The targets were deliberately civilian. The stated goal was to break the morale of the population. In March of 1938, Barcelona suffered the most intense bombing. For 3 days, from the 16th to the 18th, Italian planes dropped more than 40 tons of explosives on residential areas. The bombs destroyed apartments, markets, hospitals, and schools. The pilots were instructed to drop in successive waves to maximize casualties among rescue teams. More than 1,300 civilians died. 3,000 were wounded. The fascist press celebrated the bombings as a technical demonstration. The intervention in Spain cost 3,000 dead and 11,000 wounded Italians. Mussolini presented the campaign as a victory against communism. The veterans returned with honors. The experience served as a testing ground for tactics that would be used later on. Between 1936 and 1939, 100,000 Italians emigrated to Ethiopia and Eritrea. They received confiscated lands, state credits, and legal privileges. They lived in separate settlements with schools and hospitals exclusive for Europeans. Segregation reinforced the racial hierarchy. The conquest of Ethiopia led to sanctions from the League of Nations. However, the sanctions did not include oil, coal, or steel. France and Great Britain avoided effective measures. The partial isolation pushed Mussolini towards Germany. In October 1936, they signed the Rome-Berlin Axis. In September 1937, Mussolini visited Germany, where he was received with grand ceremonies. Military spending tripled. Public debt increased. The trade balance became deficient. By the end of 1938, Italy controlled Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. 12 million Africans lived under Italian administration. The system was maintained through constant violence. The concentration camps operated in Libya. In Ethiopia, the guerrillas remained active, attacking garrisons. On the 22nd of May of 1939, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel. It established an offensive and defensive military alliance. Mussolini imagined a relationship between equals. The reality was subordination to Berlin. The Italian economy was weaker, the army was less modernized, the industry produced less armament. The broken ambition, Italy in ruins. In 1938, Mussolini promulgated the Manifesto della Razza that introduced anti-Semitic policy in Italy. The new laws prohibited marriages between Italians and Jews. Jews were expelled from the public administration, armed forces, education, and liberal professions. Nearly 47,000 Jewish citizens lost their rights. Many had supported fascism and fought in the War of 1915. On the 22nd of May, 1939, the Pact of Steel was signed with Germany. The treaty established an offensive and defensive military alliance. When Germany invaded Poland in September, Italy was not prepared. The army lacked modern weaponry, fuel, and raw materials. Mussolini declared non-belligerence, presenting it as armed neutrality. The rapid fall of France in June of 1940 convinced Mussolini that the German victory was imminent. On the 10th of June, he declared war against France and Great Britain from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia. The offensive in the Alps against France barely made any advances. In September, General Rodolfo Graziani's troops crossed from Libya into Egypt, but were defeated by the British. In a few months, they lost Cyrenaica and more than 130,000 men were captured. In October of 1940, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Greece without consulting Hitler. The operation was planned with improvisation. The poorly equipped Italian troops were repelled and pushed towards Albania. Germany had to intervene in April of 1941 to prevent total collapse. The failure in Greece severely damaged Mussolini's image. Dependence on Germany became absolute. In July of 1941, Mussolini sent to the Eastern Front the Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia with 60,000 men. In 1942, it was expanded to 230,000 under the name of Armata Italiana in Russia. The conditions were extreme: lack of winter clothing, deficient armament, and supply problems. During the Soviet offensive of Stalingrad, the Corps was surrounded and annihilated. More than 80,000 soldiers died or disappeared. In Africa, the defeat at El Alamein in November of 1942 marked the beginning of the final retreat. In May of 1943, more than 250,000 Italian and German soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The material losses were incalculable. The economy depended almost completely on German supplies. Since 1942, Italian cities have been bombed by the Allies. Genoa, Turin, Naples, and Rome suffered repeated attacks. Thousands of civilians died. Millions left the cities seeking refuge in the countryside. Discontent spread among sectors loyal to the regime. The morale of the army plummeted. Desertions increased. On the 19th of July, 1943, Rome was bombed for the first time. The attacks destroyed entire neighborhoods, causing thousands of deaths. That same day, Mussolini met with Hitler in Feltre. The German leader demanded the continuation of resistance. The meeting took place while the bombs fell on the Italian capital. On July 24, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism was convened. It was the first meeting since the start of the war. Dino Grandi presented a motion requesting the restoration of the king's military powers. After intense discussions, the motion was approved by 19 votes to 7. Mussolini adjourned the session without realizing he had been politically defeated. On the 25th of July, the Duce went to the royal palace to inform King Victor Emmanuel III. The monarch informed him that he had decided to appoint Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new head of government. Mussolini was placed under the protection of the crown. Upon leaving the palace, he was detained by the Carabinieri and secretly transferred. The radio announced the fall of the fascist regime. In the streets of Rome and other cities, crowds tore down statues and removed party symbols. Hitler's puppet, the Republic of Silo, and the Civil War. After his dismissal on the 25th of July, 1943, Mussolini was moved between various detention residences. First on the island of Ponza, then in La Maddalena, finally in the Campo Imperatore Hotel in the Gran Sasso Massif. At over 2,000 meters of altitude, his isolation was total. On the 12th of September of 1943, German commandos executed Operation Oak. Directed by SS officer Otto Skorzeny, the mission consisted of an airborne assault with gliders. The Italian guards did not offer resistance. In less than 15 minutes, Il Duce was freed without gunfire. The Germans transferred him to Vienna and later to Munich, where he met with Hitler. The meeting showed an aged, sick, and resigned Mussolini. Hitler demanded him to return to Italy to lead a new fascist government under German supervision. On September 23, 1943, Mussolini announced by radio the creation of the Italian Social Republic based in Salo, a town on the shores of Lake Garda. Although nominally a sovereign state, it depended completely on the Third Reich. German troops controlled the territory. The fundamental decisions were made by German military commanders. Hitler defined the ISR as a transitional republic useful for maintaining discipline. The new republic proclaimed loyalty to the original principles of revolutionary fascism but lacked a popular base. Mussolini reorganized the militia under the name National Republican Guard and created the Republican Fascist Party. The ranks were composed of veterans of the regime and young fanatics. The internal purges were immediate. In December of 1943, Mussolini ordered the Verona trial against the leaders who had voted for his removal. Among the accused were Galeazzo Ciano, his son-in-law Emilio de Bono, and other prominent members. The trials lacked guarantees. Ciano and 5 companions were executed by firing squad on the 11th of January of 1944. Mussolini did not intervene to save them. The Italian territory was divided. In the south, the government of Pietro Badoglio, under Allied protection, had declared war on Germany. In the north, the RSY operated as a collaborator regime. A civil war was spreading between the two areas. The partisans launched armed resistance against German occupiers and Republican fascists. The struggle acquired a character of extreme violence. The Black Brigade, paramilitary units created in 1944 under party control, participated in torture, executions, and raids. In Turin, Milan, Genoa, and Bologna, the barracks became detention centers where prisoners were beaten and executed without trial. Reports from the German military command describe close collaboration between the Republican Guard and the Gestapo. Since November of 1943, the RSI adopted German racial laws in their entirety. The Minister of the Interior ordered the arrest of all resident or refugee Jews. The operations were carried out by the fascist police with assistance from the SS. More than 7,500 Italian Jews were deported to Auschwitz and other camps. Fewer than 1,000 survived. The violence escalated during 1944. Partisan operations multiplied. The German troops and fascist militias adopted a policy of collective reprisals. Each guerrilla attack was answered with shootings of hostages or destruction of villages. In Sant'Anna di Stazzema in August, 560 civilians were killed by the 16th SS Division. In Marzabotto, 770 inhabitants were executed. The administrative apparatus of the RS-1 was functioning worse and worse. The ministers were disputing scant authority. Alessandro Pavolini, party secretary, promoted propaganda campaigns about Italian honor and the resistance of pure fascism. The newspapers repeated slogans while the population tried to survive amid occupation and hunger. In 1944, with the Allied landing at Anzio and the liberation of Rome in June, the Republic of Salo was confined to the north. The communication routes with Germany were constantly attacked. The Republican army had 150,000 poorly armed and demoralized men. Many deserted or surrendered to the Allies. The German control over Mussolini was absolute. Communications between Salo and Berlin were filtered by the Reich Chancellery. Hitler refused to abandon him, fearing that his live capture would serve as a propaganda tool. At the end of 1944, Mussolini privately acknowledged that the war was lost. In March of 1945, the Allied offensive in the Po Valley broke the German defensive lines. The Axis troops began a general retreat towards the north. The cities were left without authority. In Milan, Turin, and Genoa, the liberation committees took control. On the 25th of April of 1945, the National Liberation Committee of the North issued a communiqué ordering a general insurrection and stating that all fascist hierarchs should be tried or executed on the spot. The hunt for the dictator, the end of the Duce. On the 25th of April of 1945, Milan was in the hands of the partisans. The National Liberation Committee of the North had proclaimed the general insurrection. the streets of the city filled with barricades. The remaining fascists entrenched themselves in government buildings. The fighting continued in some neighborhoods, but most of the urban territory was already under the control of the resistance. The decree issued by the committee ordered the immediate execution of the main responsible for fascism. The Italian Social Republic was disintegrating. German troops were fleeing north, trying to reach the Austrian border. The last leaders were trying to escape abroad. Mussolini was in the prefecture of Milan, surrounded by a small group of collaborators. His intention was to reach Switzerland and from there fly to Germany or Spain. He was accompanied by Clara Petacci, his lover for many years, some ministers of the Italian Social Republic, and a small detachment of guards. During the afternoon of the 25th, Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster, Archbishop of Milan, attempted to mediate between Mussolini and the representatives of the Liberation Committee. The meeting was held at the Archbishop's palace. The partisans demanded unconditional surrender. Mussolini rejected the terms. He understood there was no possibility of negotiation. That same night, Mussolini left Milan. The convoy departed around 8 o'clock at night on the 25th of April. It was formed by approximately 40 vehicles, mostly military trucks. They transported retreating German Waffen-SS soldiers, Italian fascists, and families of leaders. Mussolini wore a dark grey coat and carried a briefcase containing personal documents and part of the gold from the treasury of the Italian Social Republic. Clara Petacci refused to abandon him. She travelled in one of the vehicles with her brother Marcello, who pretended to be a Spanish consul. Among the fascists who were fleeing were Alessandro Pavolini, secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, Fernando Mezzasoma, Minister of Popular Culture, and Paolo Zerbino, Minister of the Interior. All had been central figures of the Salo regime. The convoy moved slowly along congested roads. Columns of retreating German soldiers, displaced civilians, and abandoned military vehicles blocked the way. The confusion was absolute. No one was certain which routes were controlled by the partisans and which remained open. The convoy followed the road that skirts Lake Como to the north. The intention was to reach the Swiss border near Chiavenna. During the night and the early morning of the 26th of April, the group advanced with difficulty. The lights were turned off to avoid being detected. The German soldiers commanding the column negotiated with partisan detachments at various checkpoints. In some cases, the guerrillas allowed passage in exchange for weapons or simply due to a lack of strength to stop such a large convoy. In the early morning of the 27th of April, the convoy reached Musso, a small town located on the western shore of Lake Como. There it was stopped at an improvised checkpoint by a partisan brigade of the Garibaldi division. The group was commanded by Urbano Lazzaro, known by his war name Bill. The partisans initially thought it was a retreating German convoy. They ordered the vehicles to stop. The German soldiers got off the trucks. The partisans began to inspect the interiors of the vehicles. Upon inspecting the trucks, the guerrillas discovered that among the German soldiers were several Italians. Some were trying to hide their faces under helmets and coats. One of them, sitting in the back of a truck, kept his head down and remained silent. A partisan watched him intently. His face was familiar despite the attempt at camouflage. The man wore a grey Luftwaffe coat and a German helmet. However, his physical build, posture, and some facial features drew attention. One of the Italian officers who had been taken prisoner days earlier recognized Mussolini. He immediately informed Lazzaro. The partisans separated Mussolini from the German group. He offered no resistance. He was pale and trembling. He did not utter a word when he was identified. The testimonies of the partisans present agree that the Duce seemed defeated, without energy or will. The Germans, for their part, did not attempt to defend him. The commander of the German column negotiated his own exit. The partisans allowed the German troops to continue northward in exchange for handing over all the Italians traveling with them. Mussolini and Clara Petacci were transferred to Dongo, a locality situated a few kilometers north of Musso. They were taken to the town hall building where they were kept under surveillance. During the 27th, the partisans searched the vehicles of the convoy. They confiscated the gold they were transporting, official documents, and weapons. Several fascist leaders captured in the same operation were executed that same night in the main square of Dongo. Among them were members of the Salo government and officers of the Republican Guard. In Milan, the National Liberation Committee received the news of Mussolini's capture. The committee leaders, Luigi Longo and Sandro Pertini, met urgently. They discussed what to do with the prisoner. Some members proposed handing him over to the Allies to be publicly tried. Others argued that a trial would take time and that there was a risk that fascist groups might try to rescue him. They also feared that the Allies might use Mussolini as a political instrument. After hours of debate, the committee made a decision. Mussolini was to be executed immediately along with the main perpetrators of fascism. The order was transmitted on the morning of the 28th of April. The Liberation Committee appointed Walter Audicio to carry out the sentence. Audicio was a communist militant and partisan commander known by his war name Colonel Valerio. He had participated in resistance operations since 1943. He was considered a disciplined and loyal man to the committee. Together with Aldo Lampredi and Michel Moretti, two trusted partisans, he set off for Dongo in an official car. Audicio arrived in Dongo around noon on the 28th of April. He informed the local partisan leaders that he was acting on behalf of the National Liberation Committee and that he carried orders to execute Mussolini and Clara Petacci. The local partisans debated for hours about the manner and place of the execution. Some believed it should be carried out in Dongo in front of witnesses. Others preferred a secluded location to avoid disturbances. Finally, it was decided to transfer the prisoners to Giulino di Mezzegra, a village situated a few kilometers to the south, where there was a stone wall in front of the entrance to Villa Belmonte. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a Ford 1100 car left Dongo with Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and the three executors. Moretti was driving the vehicle. Mussolini occupied the back seat next to Petacci. During the brief journey, he did not speak. The witnesses who were part of the escort later stated that his face was rigid and that he showed no visible fear. He was wearing a dark leather jacket and high boots. Clara clung to his arm. She wept silently. The vehicle stopped in front of the wall of Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzegra. It was a rural area distant from the center of the village, surrounded by trees and near a small iron gate. Audicio was the first to get out of the car. He ordered the prisoners to descend. He read aloud the sentence handed down by the National Liberation Committee. The text accused Mussolini of having oppressed and destroyed Italy for 20 years, of having handed it over to the German invader, and of being responsible for the death of thousands of Italians. According to Audizio's account, Mussolini tried to speak but was interrupted. He was instructed to stand by the stone wall. Clara Petacci, desperate, intervened by embracing Mussolini's body. Audicio tried to separate her by indicating that she was not condemned. She refused to move away. At that moment, Audicio raised his French MAS-38 submachine gun. When pulling the trigger, the weapon jammed. The mechanism did not work. There was a moment of tension and confusion. Audicio then took the Beretta automatic pistol carried by Moretti. He aimed at Mussolini and fired. The projectile hit the Duce in the chest. Mussolini fell forward against the wall. Audicio fired again. Clara Petacci, who remained clinging to him, was hit by several shots. Both fell to the ground almost simultaneously. It was 4 in the afternoon, with 10 minutes on the 28th of April of 1945. Audicio approached the bodies. He fired 2 additional shots at Mussolini, one to the heart and another to the head, to ensure he was dead. The Duce's face was disfigured by the impacts. Blood soaked his uniform and formed puddles on the earthen ground. Clara Petacci lay next to him. She had received shots in the abdomen and chest. The executors covered the bodies with military blankets. The bodies were placed in the trunk of the Ford car. The vehicle returned to Dongo, where the bodies of the fascist leaders executed the day before were. During the night of the 28th to the 29th of April, all the bodies were loaded into a military truck. The partisans had received orders to transport them to Milan to display them publicly. The convoy left Dongo around 1 o'clock in the morning. The journey to Milan was made via secondary roads. At several points, groups of local partisans stopped the truck demanding to see the bodies. Some wanted to confirm that Mussolini was really dead. Others simply wanted to witness the dictator's end. The bodies were briefly shown at each stop. At dawn on the 29th of April, the truck arrived in Milan. The bodies were unloaded in Piazzale Loreto, a square located in the northeast of the city. The choice of Piazzale Loreto was not random. In August of 1944, in that same place, the fascists of the Republican Guard had executed 15 members of the resistance. The corpses had been exposed for hours under the sun as a warning to those who opposed the regime. The square had become a symbol of fascist terror. Now, 10 months later, the body of the dictator would be displayed in the same place. The dictator's corpse, Piazzale Loreto and the eternal myth. Some of the wounds seemed to have been caused after death, probably during the crowd attacks or subsequent shootings at Piazzale Loreto. The face was so disfigured that it was difficult to recognize the features. Clara Petacci's body was also examined. She had received multiple bullet wounds to the torso and abdomen. The wounds confirmed that she had been hit during the execution in Giulino di Mezzegra. After completing the forensic examinations, the bodies were placed in simple wooden coffins. The partisan authorities now faced a problem. They did not know what to do with Mussolini's remains. There was the fear that any grave, marked or not, could become a place of pilgrimage for fascist sympathizers. Although the regime had fallen, there were still sectors of the population that had supported Mussolini, some out of ideological conviction, others for having held positions in the fascist administration. The new authorities did not want the dictator's grave to become a symbol of resistance or a meeting point for neo-fascists. On the 1st of May 1945, under heavy surveillance, Mussolini's corpse was buried in an unmarked grave in the Musocco cemetery on the outskirts of Milan. The coffin was placed in a common grave with no headstone or name. Only a small number of officials knew the exact location. Most cemetery employees were unaware that the Duce was buried there. Clara Petacci's body was handed over to her family and buried in a family grave in Rome. The photographs of the bodies hanging in Piazzale Loreto were published in newspapers around the world. The images appeared on the front page in the United States, Great Britain, France, and other countries. The headlines spoke of the end of Italian fascism. In some media outlets, the photographs sparked debate over whether it was appropriate to publish such graphic images. However, most editors considered that the images had historical and documentary value. In Germany, reports about Mussolini's death reached the Berlin bunker on the 30th of April. Adolf Hitler received detailed descriptions of how he had been executed and how his body had been publicly displayed. According to testimonies from German officers present in the bunker, Hitler was deeply impacted by the account. The image of his former ally hanging upside down in a public square while the crowd jeered at him made a great impression on him. That same day, the 30th of April 1945, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun in the Chancellery bunker. For almost 1 year, Mussolini's body remained in its unmarked grave in Musocco. However, the secret about its location was not completely maintained. Groups of neo-fascists began to search for the burial site. On April 22, 1946, a group led by Domenico Lecisi, a young fascist and journalist, managed to locate the grave. During the night, they dug up the grave, removed the coffin, and transported it in a vehicle. The theft of the corpse caused great upheaval. The Italian authorities launched an exhaustive search. For more than 4 months, the whereabouts of the body were unknown. The thieves moved it from one place to another to avoid being discovered. The corpse passed through several private houses and rural hideouts. Finally, in August of 1946, the police discovered that the body was hidden in the Carthusian monastery of Pavia. The Capuchin friars had received the coffin without knowing exactly its contents. When the authorities recovered the corpse, they decided to keep it under government custody. During the following 11 years, Mussolini's body remained in secret state warehouses. It was moved several times between different locations. Only a small number of high-ranking officials knew its whereabouts. Official documents recorded the body under keys and codes. This unusual situation continued until 1957. In 1957, the Italian government decided to put an end to the situation. The pressure from the Mussolini family and conservative political sectors led to the decision to return the body. On the 31st of August of that year, the remains were handed over to the widow, Rachele Guidi. The body was transferred to Predappio, the birthplace of Mussolini in the Romagna region. It was buried in the San Cassiano cemetery in a family crypt. The burial was conducted under police surveillance. Thousands of people went to the place. Some were fascism sympathizers who considered Mussolini a betrayed leader. Others were curious or local residents. From that moment, Predappio became a place of pilgrimage. Each year, especially on the anniversary of his birth on the 29th of July and on that of his death on the 28th of April, groups of neo-fascists visit the tomb. The crypt is a white marble sarcophagus with the simple inscription Benito Mussolini. The truck that carried the bodies of Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and 15 fascist leaders arrived at Piazzale Loreto in the early hours of the morning on the 29th of April of 1945. The square was empty. Only a few partisans guarded the perimeter. The bodies were unloaded in the garage of a service station of the Esso company located on the corner of the square. The cement floor was covered with oil and grease stains. The bodies were lined up on the pavement. The partisans identified Mussolini and Clara Petacci, separating them from the rest. As the sun began to rise, the first locals from the area came over. The news that the Duce's corpse was in Piazzale Loreto spread quickly by word of mouth. Within a matter of minutes, hundreds of people began to gather. By 7 in the morning, the crowd already comprised thousands of Milanese. Men, women, the elderly, and children came to see the bodies. The atmosphere was one of restrained exultation. Some cried with relief, others shouted insults at the corpses. The presence of the bodies generated intense and contradictory reactions. The first people who arrived simply watched in silence. Soon the physical assaults began. Someone kicked Mussolini's corpse, another spat on his face. A woman approached and struck the body with a stick. The violence progressively intensified. More people joined the attacks. The corpses were kicked, trampled, and beaten repeatedly. Some tore pieces of clothing as souvenirs, others threw stones and blunt objects. Mussolini's face became increasingly disfigured by the blows. The partisans guarding the place tried to maintain order by firing into the air. However, the pressure of the crowd was uncontrollable. Thousands of people crowded, trying to get closer. Those in the front rows were pushed against the bodies. The situation became more and more chaotic. The partisan commanders decided that it was necessary to do something to prevent the crowd from completely destroying the corpses. Someone suggested hanging them in a high place where they would be visible but inaccessible. At the Esso gas station, there was a horizontal metal structure that supported the roof over the gasoline pumps. The partisans brought ropes and iron hooks. They started tying the ankles of the corpses. First, they hung Mussolini's body. They hoisted it upside down with ropes until it was suspended about 3 meters from the ground. His head hung down. The arms fell inert. The torn uniform exposed wounds and bloodstains. They then hung the body of Clara Petacci next to Mussolini's. She was wearing a dark skirt and a light blouse. To prevent the skirt from falling due to gravity and exposing her body, one of the partisans pinned it. They then hung the bodies of Alessandro Pavolini, secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, Achille Starace, former secretary of the party, and other hierarchs executed in Dongo. In total, 6 corpses were left hanging upside down from the metal structure. The bodies swayed slightly with the wind. The image of the hanging corpses generated an even more intense reaction in the crowd. Thousands of people gathered to observe. Some lifted their children in their arms so they could see. Others took photographs with personal cameras. Professional photographers working for newspapers and international agencies documented the scene from multiple angles. The images captured the disfigured faces, the bloodied bodies, and the crowd surrounding the scene. The crowd continued to express their anger. Some people fired their weapons into the air in celebration. Others shouted slogans against fascism. There were those who threw objects at the hanging bodies. A woman whose son had been executed by the fascists approached with a gun and fired 5 shots at Mussolini's corpse. She declared that each bullet represented one of her dead children. The partisans did not intervene. The collective catharsis continued for hours. The bodies remained hanging all morning. The crowd did not diminish. At noon, the partisan authorities decided that it was necessary to remove the bodies. The scene had fulfilled its symbolic function but was beginning to generate problems of public order. There was also concern for the minimal dignity that had to be preserved even with the enemies. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the bodies were taken down from the metal structure. The bodies were placed back on trucks and transported to the Institute of Legal Medicine of the University of Milan. A preliminary autopsy was performed at the Forensic Institute. The doctor in charge, Dr. Mario Marchesi, examined Mussolini's corpse. He counted 9 bullet wounds on the body. The fatal shot had entered through the chest, piercing vital organs and exiting through the back. Other bullets had struck the abdomen, neck, and legs. Above the tomb there is a display case exhibiting the uniform he wore, photographs from different stages of his life, and some personal items. Visitors leave flowers, flags with the symbol of the fasces, and messages of admiration. On some occasions, groups perform the fascist salute in front of the tomb. Throughout the decades, Mussolini's figure has generated constant debates in Italy. For some, he represents the one responsible for having led the country to the catastrophe of the Second World War, for having implemented racial laws, and for having collaborated with Nazism. For others, especially among sectors of the far right, he represents a strong leader who modernized Italy and defended national interests. This ambiguity has allowed the persistence of the cult. During the 1960s and 70s, the Italian Social Movement, a neo-fascist party founded in 1946, used Mussolini's image as a historical reference. Although the Italian Constitution of 1948 prohibited the reorganization of the fascist party, the social movement operated legally by presenting itself as the heir to certain values of the regime. Over time, sectors of the Italian right have maintained an ambivalent relationship with the figure of the Duce. In the 1990s, with the transformation of the Italian political system, some leaders of the right began to make nostalgic references to the fascist regime. Elected politicians made statements downplaying the crimes of fascism or highlighting supposed positive aspects such as the construction of infrastructure. These statements generated controversy and condemnation from historians and anti-fascist sectors. Predappio has developed an economy based on tourism related to Mussolini. In the town, there are shops that sell busts, portraits, books, t-shirts, and other objects with the image of the Duce. Some shops sell wine with labels that bear his face. The house where he was born has been converted into a museum. Each year, approximately 100,000 people visit Predappio, many of them attracted by the historical figure of Mussolini. The Italian authorities have adopted a stance of tolerance towards these demonstrations. Visits to the tomb are considered expressions of historical or touristic interest, although fascist iconography remains present. The debates about whether the sale of fascist objects or gatherings in Predappio should be banned continue. Some argue that freedom of expression must prevail. Others maintain that the apology of fascism should be completely prohibited.